This is the first one in a series, what will eventually be 3, related to constitutional conventions. We're soon to announce a third one that will be in March. We have one coming up in 2 weeks on a Saturday as well. I first of all need to thank Lily and Tom, their colleagues here at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution, and they do much of the behind the scenes work to make these possible. And I also need to certainly thank John Kaminsky for kind of oversight and guidance on all the programming that we do for teachers. We're also welcoming, again, Melanie Winter. She comes from us from Raleigh, North Carolina. She's one of our discussion leaders in our document discussion sessions. And I also need to mention that she is an alumni. She holds a graduate degree from the great University of Wisconsin. We're also joined by Stuart Leibiger. I'll give you a little more of a bio here in a minute. But essentially, if you've looked at the agenda, we have 2 sessions with Stuart. There's probably a few questions and answers after his 35-minute presentation. So we'll have a little time for Q&A. Then we'll go to the document discussion sessions. And those are last probably around 15 minutes or so, maybe a little longer. We'll see how that goes. So that's kind of the agenda. At the end of the day, or around noon, we'll leave it open for a couple more minutes for some further discussion if need be. So you're welcome to stay around, but if you need to scoot at 12 o'clock, that's fine. If you have questions during Stuart's presentations, put them in the chat and we'll keep track of those as we go along. Stuart Leibiger is a professor at LaSalle University in Philadelphia. He's the author of 3 books, one book on Washington and Madison's relationship, another book on James Monroe, and this book that just came out last year on the Constitutional Convention. So you will be receiving that book. We'll mail that out here probably within the next week or so. So we'll look for that in the mail. So that's one of those value-added items that we have when you participate in these conferences. So Stuart's been with us many times. He's come and been with us in the Summer Institute that we've run for many years running. So without any further ado, Stuart, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Tim. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. As Tim mentioned, I teach at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, and LaSalle was founded in 1863, just a couple weeks before this huge event, the Battle of Gettysburg. We have on our campus at LaSalle the home of Charles Willson Peale. This is Peale, his self-portrait. He was a portrait painter, painted all the great men of his age. He was a man of the Enlightenment and a natural historian. He started the first museum in America, a natural history museum. Here's another Peale self-portrait where he's lifting the curtain to his museum to arouse your curiosity. You can see prehistoric bones, what looks like a mastodon skeleton here, living specimens, stuffed specimens, and so on. Here's a Peale family portrait, kind of a fun picture, even has the family pet in there. Peale raised a whole family of sons, and all of his sons became portrait painters. And he named each of his sons after a famous artist. And so we have Raphael Peale, Rembrandt Peale, Rubens Peale, and Titian Peale. Here's a Charles Willson Peale of George Washington at Princeton. You can see Nassau Hall in the background. There was one occasion where all the Peales, Peale and his sons, they all set up their easels in a circle and everybody painted Washington at once. Somebody commented that Washington was getting peeled all around. So here's the Peale family farmhouse on our campus. And isn't this exactly how you imagine rural Philadelphia? So here's a Peel sketch from his sketchbook that shows his farmhouse on our campus. And this dirt lane on the right, this is 20th Street, Philadelphia, which goes right through our campus. And a couple Peel sketches of George Washington. All right, on to the Constitutional Convention. I'll begin with a couple fun facts. The convention, of course, met at Independence Hall, Philadelphia, but that's not how the building looked in 1787. It looked like this: no tower. The original tower had been taken down, and the current one was not built until 1828. And the building was not called Independence Hall then. It was called the Pennsylvania State House. It was the capital of the state of Pennsylvania. Didn't get the name Independence Hall until 1824, when the Marquis de Lafayette returned back to America for a visit. Lafayette went to Philadelphia, saw the building, dilapidated, falling apart, and Lafayette remarked, "Philadelphia, what has happened to your Hall of Independence?" And then the building was saved and the name Independence Hall born in 1824. Second fun fact, everybody knows what the weather was like in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, right? Hot and humid, painfully hot and humid. The hot, humid weather has become the stuff of legend. It's part of our national narrative. Not only did the delegates have to overcome their differences with each other, they had to overcome the weather. In fact, though, the hot weather, kind of a myth. The temperature that summer was below normal. Philadelphia enjoyed a cool summer in 1787 with temperatures below average. The month of July, 4 degrees below normal. On June 9th, a local resident wrote the following: "This is the first day this spring that a fire would be disagreeable. So cold and wet has been the season." Of course, even a cool summer in Philadelphia can be uncomfortably warm, especially if it's humid, and we don't know what the humidity was. The humid weather would be especially unpleasant if you're meeting in a sealed room without any ventilation. To the Massachusetts or New Hampshire delegates, even a cool Philadelphia summer would still have felt hot. And even cool summers have hot stretches. So the stories of hot weather are not false, certainly, but they are perhaps overblown. Third fun fact, here's one of the most important convention delegates, Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Sherman helped engineer the Great Compromise over representation, which is why Connecticut license plates say the Constitution State. Only 3 delegates spoke more than Sherman at the convention. But guess what? Sherman only attended by accident. Connecticut originally chose a man named Erastus Walcott to attend, but Walcott turned down his appointment. Why? Walcott had never had smallpox before, and so he lacked immunity. I guess that's something we can relate to today. Walcott was afraid if he went to Philadelphia, he'd get smallpox and die. And so Walcott turned down his appointment. In Walcott's place, Connecticut sent Sherman, who ended up being one of the most important delegates. That's what you call contingency in history. Small accidents and chance occurrences changing the course of human events. Fourth fun fact, Philadelphia was the biggest metropolis in the US at the time, with a population of 40,000 people. It was a center of culture, art, commerce, and diversity. So you'd think the delegates would have been thrilled that the convention met in such a fascinating city. But as you know from reading some of those letters that Tim sent out, that's not the case. Many of these delegates hated being in Philadelphia. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut wrote, "I mix with company without enjoying it, and am perfectly tired with flattery and forms. To be very fashionable, we must be very trifling, and make and receive 1,000 professions which everybody knows there's no truth in." Or George Mason of Virginia, who wrote, "I grow heartily tired of the etiquette and nonsense so fashionable in this city." Mason wrote that on May 27th, the third day of the convention. Or John Langdon of New Hampshire, quote, "Notwithstanding the riches and splendor of this city, the fatiguing sameness makes me sick." Langdon wrote that after less than 2 weeks in Philly. But one delegate who absolutely loved Philadelphia, George Washington. Washington resided as a guest in the mansion of Pennsylvania delegate Robert Morris. The house no longer stands today, but this is what it looked like. Washington later resided in the same building as President of the United States, 1790 to 1797. Believe it or not, when Independence Mall was built in the 1950s, they knocked this building down because they didn't know what it was. And then after they knocked it down, they said, "Oh no, we just knocked down the president's house." So here's the footprint of the house. It was on High Street, which we call Market Street today. And of course, one of the ironies you can see where the slave quarters once sat is almost exactly where the Liberty Bell sits today. So they knocked the building down by accident. And then, to add insult to injury, they built a restroom there. But fortunately, about 20 years ago, this open air museum was built, which marks out the footprint of the building. During the 127 days of the convention, Washington had an unbelievably active social life. Washington, by the way, was there without Martha. She stayed at Mount Vernon. Washington went out to dinner 106 times, went out to tea 72 times, took 13 day trips, and attended a concert or the theater 6 times. He sat for artists 4 times and went to church twice. So here's a Peale portrait of Washington that was done that summer. I think this is interesting. Washington obviously brought his Continental Army uniform with him to Philadelphia. Well, enough trivia, on to the substance of the convention. So as Tim mentioned, today's talk is based on my book, The Constitutional Convention of 1787, published by ABC Clio, 2019. You can see it's part of a series, Guides to Events, to Historic Events in America. I wanted to give the book a subtitle, but a subtitle did not fit the series format, and so I couldn't use a subtitle. But the subtitle I wanted, A System to Last for Ages. That is a quote from Madison at the convention, June 26th. You know, we are designing a system of government to last for ages. Of course, there's many, many books on the convention. Mine is fairly short. It's under 250 pages of text. It's scholarly, factually accurate, and based almost entirely on primary sources. But maybe most important, I wanted to write a chronological narrative of the convention. When people teach or write about the convention, they often use a topical format that presents the convention as a series of compromises. Large versus small states, North versus South, federal versus state powers, legislative versus executive versus judicial branches, and so on. I have used that topical approach in my college lectures. The topical approach is organized, it's neat and tidy, but it's a little bit too neat and tidy. In reality, the convention was messy. It meandered all over the place. Nothing ever seemed finalized because every decision of the convention was reconsidered and changed again and again. So instead of using a topical approach, my book is a chronological narrative that tries to capture the complexity and messiness of the convention. A chronological narrative is difficult to write. I try to tell a story from beginning to end. The convention met from May 25th to September 17th, 1787. It met Monday through Saturday. The delegates took Sunday off to rest. It usually met about 5 hours a day, from about 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. How many states present? 12, because Rhode Island was not there. But 12 states were never actually there at once. Never more than 11 present, because New York left for good before New Hampshire arrived. And yes, Alexander Hamilton of New York returned at the very end, but New York was not officially represented because New York needed 2 delegates to be present to be officially represented. Each state specified how many delegates had to be present for the state to be officially represented. The number was between 1 and 4. Some states required only 1 delegate to be official. Some states required 2, 3, or as many as 4. The convention voted by state, like the Continental and Confederation Congresses. And so Independence Hall has a table for each state. The delegates caucus among themselves from each state and then cast a single vote. So with no more than 11 states present, all it took to carry a vote in the convention was 6 states. 74 delegates were elected by the states, but 19 of them stayed home. The best, most famous example would be Patrick Henry, who didn't attend because supposedly he said he smelt a rat. So there's a self-selection process with some of the less sympathetic people to reform staying home and not attending. 55 delegates attended the convention, but only about 40 present on any given day. Of course, they were rich white men, lawyers, planters, merchants, army officers. Their ages ranged from a young of 26 years old to the oldest, 81 years old. Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey, the youngest, and of course, Ben Franklin, the oldest. None of the delegates was in his 70s. Roger Sherman, the second oldest at 67, and George Washington at 55 was one of the maybe half dozen oldest guys there. So there's Franklin, the oldest, age 81. He was too infirm to walk the 2 blocks from his home to Independence Hall, and so each day he would be picked up in a sedan chair like this one, picked up by 4 convicts from the Walnut Street prison, who would, I guess they were on some kind of prison release, and they would carry Franklin to Independence Hall and go back to prison for the day and then carry him home at the end of the day. Franklin was also too infirm to deliver his speeches in person. And so he wrote them out longhand, and James Wilson read them to the convention for him. Franklin did not make distinguished policy proposals at the convention. Most of his suggestions were ignored, but he did play a valuable role by promoting conciliation and compromise. All right, here's one of the most useful, valuable things in my book, but I cannot claim credit for it. This is a table of speeches, motions, and committee assignments in the Constitutional Convention, compiled by John Kaminsky and Michael Stevens, and they very graciously granted permission to include it in the book. And I think maybe this is the first time this is published in a book about the convention. So you can see the delegates listed, their speeches, motions, and committee assignments, but they're listed in the order of the number of speeches that they gave. Now, keep in mind, the convention actually sat for a total of 81 days. And so anybody who's giving more than 162 speeches is averaging more than 2 speeches a day. And there's 3 people who fall into that category: James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, and James Madison. So what was the charge to the convention? What was their assignment? Well, it was ambiguous. The Confederation Congress said the convention was for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation to make them adequate to the exigencies of the Union. But what if a revision of the Articles could not solve the problems of the Union? Then what? The convention's answer: they did not revise the Confederation, they scrapped it. Instead, the convention proposed a national government of people, because only a national government could save the Union, not a confederation of states. And so let's think about the difference between a confederation and a national government. A confederation is a league of states. In a confederation, you have a national government and state governments. But the states are supreme. Real political power rests at the state level. Also, in a confederation, the central government interacts with the state governments, but does not interact directly with the people. Only the state governments interact directly with the people. That is, the states act as intermediaries between the central government and the people. So, for example, the Confederation Congress could not impose a tax on the people. Only the state governments could tax the people. Indeed, the Confederation did not have the power to tax at all. All it could do was requisition the states for money, that is, to ask the states for money, which leads to the problem of free riding, where states don't pay their requisitions, they let other states pay, and will enjoy the benefits. Maybe you have some friends who are free riders. The Articles did not have a Bill of Rights because Congress did not interact with the people, and so it could not violate the people's personal rights and liberties. Under the Confederation, Congress only possessed powers expressly delegated to it by the Articles. All other powers belong to the states. Think about what a weak federal government that is. Congress only possessed powers expressly delegated to it by the Articles. All other powers belong to the states. A national government, in contrast, is supreme to the states, and it interacts directly with the people without the states as intermediaries. On May 25th, Washington was unanimously elected the convention president. He was elected by a vote of states. There were seven states present that day, and so the vote was 7-0. Washington was pretty silent during the convention. He really only gave 2 speeches, one on the first day and another short speech on the last day. So why was Washington so quiet? Because he had nothing to say? Well, no, that's not it. As convention president, Washington wanted to stay above the fray. And he was not an orator. That's not his forte. But Washington found other ways to influence the proceedings. There's a wonderful story that comes to us from Georgia delegate William Pierce. So the convention, of course, met in secret. We'll talk about that in a minute. And one day, at the end of the day, one of the delegates leaves behind notes in the assembly room threatening the secrecy of the convention. And so Washington picks up the notes on the way out. The next day, he admonished the delegates, quote, "I must entreat gentlemen to be more careful, lest our transactions get into the newspapers and disturb the public by premature speculation. I know not whose paper this is, but let him who owns it take it." And Washington throws down the paper and he walks out. Well, nobody ever claimed those notes. Now, Pierce reaches into his pocket for his notes and his pocket is empty. And so he panics. I'm the one who threatened the convention secrecy. And then he goes up to the table with trepidation and he looks and it's not his handwriting. There's somebody else's notes. And then Pierce runs home and he finds the notes in his coat pocket. But the bottom line, when Washington called you out, you trembled with shame like a child. The convention adopted the following rules. 1 vote per state. And of course, the small population states love that. 1 state, 1 vote, because that makes tiny Delaware just as powerful as mighty Virginia, even though Virginia has 13 times as many people. Another rule, any motion that was agreed to could be reconsidered later. Nothing is final. That made it possible for the convention to experiment, to take chances, to be bold. And then another rule, the secrecy rule. Convention proceedings will be secret. Well, why secrecy? Secrecy ensures that the delegates talk to each other instead of grandstanding for the media. Secrecy enables the delegates to speak their minds freely. It enables them to change their minds later on without charges of inconsistency. Secrecy helps the convention resist outside pressure until the whole package is complete. Secrecy minimizes false rumors that could upset the public. It was not unusual for legislative bodies to meet in secret in the 18th century. Most, but not all, of the delegates adhered to the secrecy rule. George Washington, in his private diary, writes, "The convention is secret, and so I am not going to put any of the proceedings of the convention into my diary." Now, Franklin would often entertain the delegates at his home, 2 blocks away on Franklin Court, underneath the mulberry tree in the yard. Here, Franklin is entertaining Hamilton, Wilson, and Madison. And one evening, Franklin is showing his guests this scientific specimen that he has. It's a 2-headed snake that was preserved in a jar. And then Franklin says, well, you know, this specimen reminds me of something that happened in the convention today. And he started to tell the story, and then somebody said, Dr. Franklin, remember the secrecy. And so Franklin couldn't tell the story. So if the convention met in secret, how do we know what happened? Of course, there were note takers. 10 note takers whose notes have survived. The note takers included Rufus King, Alexander Hamilton, Robert Yates, John Lansing, George Mason, William Pierce. But of course, Madison was the most important. He was the one note taker who was present every single day of the convention from beginning to end. Of all the surviving notes that we have, Madison took 75% of them. All the other note takers combined, 25%. Madison wrote shorthand notes during the debates, then copied them out as soon afterwards as possible. And so here's a page of Madison's longhand notes. So the notes come out to maybe about 10 printed pages a day. Madison's entire notes is like a 700-page book. Madison was the last survivor of the delegates. He wasn't the youngest, but he was the last one standing. He died in 1836 at the age of 85. Madison arranged that his notes would be published posthumously after all the delegates were dead. Now, the secrecy rule was lifted when the convention ended, but Madison must have felt some obligation still not to publish the notes until they were all dead. There's the great little Madison, as Dolly called him. About Madison, one eyewitness said, "I never saw so much mind crammed into so little matter." So why did Madison take the notes? As a student of history, he was disappointed that no accounts existed of the founding of the ancient confederacies. He wanted to spare future generations that same type of frustration. Now, how accurate are Madison's notes? Are they a sacred, unquestionable text? Well, a few years ago, Mary Bilder published a book called Madison's Hand. And she argues that Madison doctored his notes years after the convention to make himself look better. That is, he inserted new versions of his speeches later on. New versions of his speeches to make them less nationalist and more anti-slavery than they really were. Well, as Gordon Lloyd has argued, I think the problem with this argument is that if Madison doctored his notes, he was a pretty lousy doctor. Because there's so much more he would have changed if he was trying to enhance his reputation. Read Madison's notes. He's very stubborn, uncompromising, a sore loser at times. He bullies and threatens the small states. So we've got to remember the notes are a primary source, and we have to treat them like other primary sources. It's one person's account of an event. We need to watch out for biases and corroborate it with other sources. There was a convention secretary, William Jackson, but he only recorded the motions and votes and not the speeches. All right, Tim, how are we doing on time? Is this a good?
Well, you're right around 30 minutes. If you, so yeah, you can take a couple more if you need, or it's up to you.
Yeah, so I'm sort of at the halfway point of what I've got. So
yeah,
and you know, I'm about to launch into like the Virginia plan. So if there are any questions, we could do that, or I could keep going.
I have a quick one maybe to get us started. I was intrigued early in your presentation. You mentioned what they were supposed to do. Their instructions were a little ambiguous. I'm trying to mesh that with several of the states' instructions to their delegates. Seem to say directly revise the articles or revise the Constitution. So I'm curious as to your conclusion as their instructions being a little ambiguous when several of the states don't seem to be quite ambiguous.
Well, I guess maybe ambiguous is not the right word. Maybe inconsistent would be a better word. You've got the instructions from the Annapolis Convention. You've got the instructions from the Confederation Congress. And then you do have, as you mentioned, the instructions from the various states to their delegates. And yes, some of those are not ambiguous. Delaware, as the Delaware delegates point out, we don't have the authority, to create this national government that the Virginia plan is talking about. But interestingly, they threaten to walk out at times, but they don't. They stay. And the argument that James Wilson makes is, all we're doing is drawing up a proposal. And, we can propose anything. And then it's up to the American people and the people of the various states, whether they accept it or not. But, we're just proposing. And so we might as well, be bold and try to fix the problem. But yeah, I think your point is a good one, that many of the instructions are not ambiguous. They're very clear, but as a whole, the instructions from the various states and Annapolis Convention, Congress, they are, I guess you could say, inconsistent. And some of them are ambiguous within themselves, though. Revise, but fix the problems of the union.
It looks like Andrea has a question.
Yeah, I have a very specific question about procedure. You mentioned the 3 different rules, 1 vote per state. I guess I've been under the impression that each state had to have 2 delegates in order to actually have a vote. Is that accurate or not accurate?
That is not accurate. So if you go back and look at these instructions to all the delegates from their states, every single state will say how many delegates have to be there for it to be official. And some states required only 1. Some states, Pennsylvania, required 4 to be present. The one state that did not specify was New York. And it's not in Madison's notes, but clearly the convention decided that New York needed to have 2 to be official. And so what happens is New York sent 3 guys total, Yates, Lansing, and Hamilton. And in July, Yates and Lansing go home. Hamilton goes home as well, but Hamilton comes back. And Hamilton, we'll talk about this later, he signs on the last day, but he could not officially sign for New York. He was just signing for himself. And so New York as a state does not sign the Constitution because it was not officially represented on the last day.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
Well, I think let's go into our document discussion groups. I guess Lily will be waving the magic wand and moving us into those breakout rooms. So let's dedicate 15 minutes, Lily,